idea of what movie making is like.
Okay. Well, I'm going to try something different this time. I want to just jump right
But one thing, mention the magnificence of Amberson. You didn't the second time, because this won't be known on the film.
I want to jump right into my thoughts about Wells and the Magnificent Ambersons. I was struck by a sort of a pessimistic message that he had in both Citizen Kane and the Magnificent Ambersons. And as pointed out in your reading, the characters all seem to deal with something about their past. And but the message isn't the optimistic sort of like life is short, like enjoy it. It's more that the past is no good to us, that we can't rekindle the past, we can't have it back, it's gone or it's dead. And the movies, well, at least the initial version of Magnificent Ambersons didn't have a happy ending, and the alterations were done to sort of please the audience, and it was happier. You'll find that out today. You haven't seen it yet, so. The pessimism sort of surprised me, and so I guess I spent some time looking for sort of a deeper, positive message.
Go ahead.
In the documentary, Wells he mentions that he doesn't like watching other people's films, and I thought that was really interesting and sort of telling. And he says that it restricts his future work. He feels like it sort of takes away his innocence as a filmmaker. And then also in the reading, he mentions that he doesn't believe that you need any film knowledge to make a good movie, that you just need an understanding of culture and of human history. And he talks about holding up a mirror to nature, and that's all you really need.
But at the end of that, he also says, a mirror is only a mirror. It's your understanding and curiosity about the world at large that's essential over and above the techniques that you have to have in order to make a film. So that's the element of meaning, supplementing technique, which he was very sensitive to.
So the pessimistic view, or my read on it, is almost as if he's saying that you don't want to grow up. You don't want to learn the rules of filmmaking or society. That if you can maintain your innocence, you'll sort of never die. Or you'll never have regrets. In the movies and the films, the characters visibly age and they die. There's a scene in The Magnificent Ambersons where there's a newspaper headline and it says that the automobile casualties mount. And it's sort of a representation of the automobile wrecking society. Like technology is moving forward, and yet something like the aristocratic society is dying in some sense. And in this sense, it's not a positive message, but there's something powerful in it. Something about human nature, like that is the way life is. Like we do die.
Okay, let me interrupt two things. First, the idea that the young Minifer should be wrecked physically by an automobile has an ironic place within the structure of the narrative, because all of the troubles come out of the time when he prevents his mother from marrying the automobile manufacturer. I don't know if you remember that much from the documentary last week. What you saw was the scene in which George, the boy, George Minifer, says, I think automobiles should never have been invented. They're a big mistake. And the automobile maker, played by Joseph Cotton, says, well, maybe you're right, but there's no stopping them. They're going to cover the land. And, well, what happens in the narrative, there's no stopping them. And then after George and the whole family are destroyed financially, he gets hit by a car. And it's sort of as if the machine is taking its revenge upon him. There's a kind of irony in that. But it's all part of the picture of American reality. The second point I want to make is more pervasive, that goes beyond Magnificent Ambersons, what Ed was saying about Wells's outlook not being optimistic, if anything, pessimistic, in a sense, but he's pessimistic in the way in which a great pessimist philosopher would be. And what I thought of at that moment was Schopenhauer, the 19th century German philosopher, who thought that life is meaningless. There are no gods. There is no Christian God. Everything is controlled simply by energy of a material sort, which is the will, because it's just energy, force in nature, but it doesn't have any intelligence, and we are simply products of that. Very pessimistic, negativistic view about the world we live in which ideals are reduced to matter, and matter makes no sense, right? Nietzsche grew up with Schopenhauer and Hauerian philosophy. His first books were a great deal about Schopenhauer, and as he got older, he rejected him and said what one has to do is not to say no to nature in the negative way that Schopenhauer does, but to say yes and pursue ideals even if the world doesn't make sense in the traditional religion, so that you get this contrast between a kind of pessimism in Schopenhauer and a kind of negativism in Nietzsche. Schopenhauer lived to what was then a ripe old age, and he had a pleasant life. Nietzsche lost his mind, his faculties at least, fairly early, in his late 40s, and had a miserable life until then, because he's always had illnesses, some of which might have been psychosomatic, so that he was the optimist, and the one who lived well was the pessimist. In one place, Nietzsche said, I'll get to the point about Wells in just a second. Nietzsche said Schopenhauer called himself a pessimist, but he lived a good life. He played on the flute in the evening. He ate well. The modern kind of thing the modern world is destroying. The same theme as the Magnificent Ambersons. And then at the end of this little pessimistic remark, he says, we're all going to die. Everything will turn into ash. There will be nothing eventually. But what of it? Sing as long as you can. In other words, the artist surmounts the negativism in reality by means of his art, and so he ends up with this very optimistic point of view. I think that is relevant here too. If you ask him, are people going to go mad or lose heart because of the theme of Magnificent Amberson, particularly the way Wells presented it? He'll say, no, it's a work of art. I find it exhilarating. So if you're an artist, you can always have a happy life dedicating yourself to your art. Now, if you extend that to science and to practice and whatever is your pursuit of life, life will become meaningful as a function of your pursuit rather than your expecting some objective validation because the world is what the traditional, particularly traditional religious views said it was. Go ahead.
I'd like to go actually all the way back to your first point where you talk about the automaker, Eugene Morgan.
That's Eugene Morgan.
His comment about automobiles, when it is suggested that the invention is worthless. He makes it's a really great line, and he talks about how it's true that the automobiles carry people forward, but really humanity, society might actually be moving backwards. And then there's another point, I think we might have seen it in the clip in the documentary about, I think Wells is narrating, and he talks about how back before the 19th century, in the late 19th century, people had time for everything. Then the automobile comes along and people are getting everywhere faster, but in fact they have less time for everything.
Well, you saw a clip about that in the biography, remember? The documentary.
It sort of struck me like that sort of message, sort of timeless. I mean, I think of a computer now. People always have said, like, oh, it'll save us time. In fact, it somehow seems we have more work.
I think that's a bit of nostalgia in Wells. Usually he's not. That was the point in that discussion in my chapter of him about comparing him to Huston's film The Dead. Huston's film is filled with sentimentality and nostalgia. Wells generally avoids that the way James Joyce does. but I think this would be one counter instance in which he is nostalgic.
But at the same time, there was something also negative about technology and sort of the masses. So I was a little confused as to what Wells' feeling was about. So I guess sort of I thought the positive message that I ended up this feeling as I thought about this for a while is sort of what you were saying, that from this sort of pessimistic idea of in a society that we all die and can't have the past, if you can sort of come to the realization that you don't really need certain material things, you don't need success to be happy. Like, you should just sort of enjoy what you have. And that was, I guess, the eventual message that I got. But it was sort of, it wasn't on the surface. It wasn't obvious, because the story or the two movies of Wells that I've seen are sort of sad. But I think,
Anybody want to say something? Well,
I think it's hard because they haven't really seen the movie. Yeah. So, just jumping topics. When I turned on, when I was watching Magnificent Ambersons, it's black and white. It's an old movie, and so for me, it's hard to relate. I feel sort of out of touch with the times, and so I'm sort of lulled to sleep. I'm expecting a certain type of character, like sort of a boring character, and I was really surprised. The character of George, who's the main character in the movie. He's this bratty, spoiled kid, and I thought it was just a tremendous character because it was so unexpected to encounter this level. There's a scene where he's bickering with his aunt, like in a really childish way, and I thought it was just a terrific scene because.
Have any of you seen Arouse's more recent remake for television? It was on Arts and Entertainment about 2 years ago. And I thought Tim Holt, who plays that part in Magnificent Ambersons, was absolutely right, and the person who played it in the other one was not anywhere as good. Do any of you know a movie called The Treasure of the Sierra Madre? If you ever seen it, you'll never forget it. And now Tim Holt, about 10 years later, had an important role in that. I thought you might like to put the two together. Go ahead.
So yeah, I really enjoyed this role of George, and I wondered if because Wells was sort of a new and maybe naive filmmaker, that he had no idea that like he was sort of unconventional. At least it seemed unconventional to me because it was unexpected. And I don't want to talk too much about the scenes because you haven't seen it yet. But that was a pleasant surprise. And jumping around, so we heard in the documentary and in the biography that the ending, 45 minutes were cut at the end, and I thought the ending was pretty bad, actually.
Was what bad?
It was bad. I mean,
I'm sorry, I didn't understand.
I didn't like the ending.
The ending of the documentary.
Sorry, Magnificent Ambersons. They mentioned in the documentary that Magnificent Ambersons was cut short.
45 minutes.
And I thought it really hurt the film because it completely changed the tone, sort of abruptly at the end. There's a scene with the aunt, and she's overcome with despair. She can't even stand up. She's really upset. And then the very next scene, the final scene, she's walking down a hallway in a hospital, and she's sort of smiling contentedly. She seems sort of hopeful. And it's just so the discontinuity of those two scenes next to each other just really doesn't make a lot of sense to me. And so I thought that was a weakness of the film right at the end.
Of the resulting from the cutting, yes. From the destruction. Did you give any thought to the idea of the myth of the past? Anything you want to say about that?
Can you talk a little about what you mean by? I mean, I read the chapter. And
well, I think it's a phrase that's used by Wells, and he says he has a fascination for values that existed in earlier societies that don't exist anymore, and that they often provide the key to something, and he's curious about that. I think it's his way of formulating a view about the nature of time. Past isn't something to be glamorized, to be nostalgic about, sentimental about, because the past is gone, but we we turn it into mythology. We mythologize it, and this often happens in different forms of art. We're sitting here and looking at a great visual portrayal of the myth of the birth of Venus. The painting is La Nascita di Venere by Botticelli in the end of the 15th century. The myth itself comes out of Ovid in the 1st century A.D., and by the time of the Renaissance, anything related to antiquity was given a great deal of attention. So that this would be at that time up-to-date version of the myth, but the myth itself originates from the past. Nobody in Italy in the 15th century thought that there was such a creature as Venus, the goddess of love, and that she was born on a half shell, and that she arose out of the ocean, and there are the sort of goddesses or nymphs of wind and a handmaiden for Venus herself. Nobody believed it literally, but it was a beautiful myth. And the meaning of Wells is that the past is simply dead, and all we do in the present is create myths about it. Now, there's an irony there, because without the myths, we would lose out on a great many works of art. With the myths, taken literally, we are falsifying the past. And so the question is, in our scientific age, how can we live with both the truth of how things are, faced realistically, which is what Wells tries to do in his movies until they're chopped up by the studio and beyond his control, in this search for the truth, in harmony with an understanding of the beauty of the past. And I think that goes with the idea of we're all going to die, but what of it? The what of it is make a work of art out of the myth, but don't be fooled by the myth. The quote I give you or mention in the chapter is Wells' saying of John Ford. John Ford was a maker of myths, whereas he, Wells, wanted to examine them, and that's a big difference. A maker of myths, as I argue that John Huston is in The Dead, is somebody who sentimentalizes the past, Dublin, 1904, who enjoys the idea of a Christmas party, or it's New Year's party, 11 days after Christmas, at the feast of the Epiphany. That all of that being sentimentalized in terms of what Dublin was like in the good old days, right? Horse-drawn carriage and snowfalls that don't cause the tires to skid out of control, but rather gently covers the ground and makes a nice pattern of black and white. That's how Huston does it, because he's a myth maker. The way that John Ford is a myth maker in his movies about the Wild West, which you can be pretty sure was nothing like the way he portrays them. Joyce was different. Joyce had wanted to examine, like a journalist, and not only a journalist, but an investigatory reporter, what reality was like in Dublin in that year, 1904, and not to fudge about anything. Wells is in the Joycean tradition. He wants to be a realist, showing what it was really like to have been born in a small town in the Middle West when automobiles were being introduced, how the great families who didn't invest in the right thing could lose their shirt the way that the Amersons do because they invested in this headlight that doesn't work except when the car is running at, 50 miles an hour, and they pour all their money into it and then they're wiped out. That's what reality is like. And the family is destroyed. The love affairs end up very badly. The studios consider that too downbeat. You remember that was the term that Wells used in the documentary, so they changed it into a sort of happy ending, right? That's not what Wells wanted. He wanted to examine the myth of the past, even at the risk of being a little nostalgic about the horse car, and to build a work of art so we can live with that. Well, you know, it's all going to be destroyed. It doesn't matter how long the Emersons flourished. Eventually they, like everybody else, is going to be destroyed. You know, the earth is going to be burned up by the sun one of these thousands of years. But in the meantime, what of it? Dance, do your art, enjoy the moment of creativity. So what Wells is really espousing is the goodness of being alive and being creative. And above all, in the face of a world that is not responsive to our system of values. Now that seems to me crucial in understanding everything that he does. And the myth of the past is what he examines for the sake of articulating that.
Between Citizen Kane and
Michelle, yes.
Well, just because I haven't seen The Emersons yet.
You will too.
Between the two of them, which one do you prefer, or which one do you think is Wells's better work?
I think Citizen Kane overall.
Is better.
But I wonder if it hadn't been manipulated, if it hadn't been altered. I think I enjoyed the characters better in Magnificent Emersons. They were more interesting to me. They were more fun, I guess, just from purely entertainment. Well, in a lot of senses. But overall, Citizen Kane.
Wells said, and forgive me if I'm repeating myself from a previous class, Wells said the trouble with Citizen Kane is that it looks just like a young filmmaker trying to prove to the world that he can make movies. And that's exactly what it was. And it's brilliant. I mean, all of these incredible shots and angles and the dissolves and the structure of it show a master technician learning his trade or having just learned his trade and showing off, which is what we artists always do. I mean, professors like me. In The Magnificent Emersons, just a year later, he's adapting himself to a novel, Pulitzer Prize-winning novel, big success, which has a narrative, in places even sentimental, which he's going to manipulate according to his technique, but the technique is not as evident. For one thing, he didn't invent the story, and he invented the story, collaborated on the plot of Citizen Kane. Here he has to adhere, to some extent at least, to a novel that he admires very much, because he was a Middle Westerner himself. He was born in Wisconsin, and he understands that. The myth of the past, he says in a dialogue he had with Bogdanovich about this, he said that for me the myth of the past, the golden age that I'm always harking back to, occurred in Grand Detour, Illinois. Grand Detour is a small town, it's very small, that his father, who was a high-living person after his wife died, bought and turned it into a haven for his friends, particularly his friends in the arts and people who were down and out, artists who were down and out on their luck. So it was a little paradise. It was a little world in which there were, I think, no cars were allowed in it, no electric lights, I think. It was a little primitive establishment, almost a commune, in which Wells, being a teenager, could grow up and have a great time. He understood the Middle West, and he understood what Tarkington was doing in his novel. And that gives that movie a very different orientation from Citizen Kane. I would have thought, given the evidence, what Bogdanovich says in that documentary, for instance, that if the 45 minutes had not been cut, it might have been better than Citizen Kane and maybe one of the few greatest movies ever made. Maybe the greatest, who knows. So it's a real tragedy that the world has lost that.
Has anyone seen the remake? I think it came out 2 years ago or so, recently. I wanted to watch that as well. But.
Well, the remake is based on the original script. So some of Wells's material comes back in, but it's never doesn't come back in the way Wells would have done it, because there's hardly any, if any, footage, the actual celluloid that survived, and the rest, what we see of the rest, is nowhere in the class of Orson Welles in terms of technique. So that the remake is interesting, and that's why I spent the pages discussing it in my chapter, but it's not a competitor.
I feel like I have one problem with the sort of idea of the myth of the past and how that works out. In both movies, Magnificent Ambersons and Citizen Kane, there's sort of a tragedy that changes the past, and now you have reality, which is sort of bleaker. In Citizen Kane, sort of the myth of the past was this sort of wonderful, perfect childhood. He's playing in the snow. And so the tragedy then is his sort of personal tragedy where he's taken away from his parents. And but personally, like I remember my past sort of fondly. It doesn't feel like a myth. Like no tragedy has happened to me yet. I don't see anything wrong with sort of fondly remembering past experiences. But in his movies, it takes some tragedy. And it's not clear to me that society's advancement is always a tragedy. It's not clear to me that that we shouldn't think fondly or even sort of exaggerate our past, because there's something positive about that, at least for me.
Well, there are different interpretations. One, Welles vehemently rejects in the book called This is Orson Welles, which is his interviews with Bogdanovich, that I think I told you I read over and over. I loved it so much. Came out recently. And that is the sort of psychoanalytic one, ascribing this sense of loss in the past to the death of Wells's mother. Wells's mother died when he was 9 years old. Before that, he was a child prodigy. She was a music teacher and probably a concert pianist, but I don't think she had a great career. No, I think she was also an opera singer. Yeah, she was an opera singer as well, but not with a great career. He was a reluctant genius. There's a story about his piano teacher who came to the house because they were wealthy and was giving him exercises or a lesson, and then suddenly the piano teacher rushes into the next room where his mother was and says, Mrs. Wells, George Orson, or George, well, his name then was George Orson Welles. Anyhow, the boy has climbed out of the window and is standing on the ledge, threatening to jump if we don't cancel the lessons, right? A kind of suicide bomber. And what should I do? And she calmly says in the hearing of the boy, well, if he's going to jump, he's going to jump. Wells heard that, obviously, and sheepishly came back. But when she died, he stopped taking lessons. Before that, he had conducted before he was 10 years old. He played the violin, he played the piano. There were even newspaper articles about this boy genius as a musician, and he never continued. He never went on with music after that. As I mentioned in the chapter, he did write the song Oh, Mr. Kane. He wrote that for that. His great friend was Bernard Herrmann, who wrote the scores for the first two movies, Citizen Kane and Magnificent Ambersons, and they talked sort of on the same level as fellow musicians, so that he knew a lot about music, but he never performed or never was active as a musician after his mother died. And so one theory is the rosebud in his life is his mother and his loss of her. He denied that. He said, my mother was nothing like Keynes's mother.
I'm curious what impression you all got from the documentary about Wells. If you took anything from that, what you thought of it.
Or Wells's life as a whole, his creative life. What did you think of that?
I think it's surprising that he can be stage fright for someone, and it's based on his performance in Citizen Kane.
I don't know if the camera can pick you up. Come closer.
I'm okay. Yeah, it's good. I'm surprised that based on Wells' performance in Citizen Kane, I'm surprised that he can actually be stage fright to perform in front of a camera. Actually, I think
you found. I don't remember any stage fright.
Well, I think
there was one moment in a scene where he was like standing in front of a crowd on a ship. It was supposed to be on a ship, I think. And he said that. And there was another part where he's.
Where in Citizen Kane?
No,
in the documentary?
He was a French actress, and he was like.
There was a French actress describing about how he was avoiding doing his.
Jeanne Moreau, the great, wonderful French actress, yeah.
And how he
that's true. He couldn't go on. This was in the making of his Falstaff movie called Chimes at Midnight, that he couldn't go on with the excuse that his makeup kit was lost.
Was he just embarrassed about like an intimate scene, or was he?
I don't know. I don't know.
One doesn't know the whole story, obviously. He did have this thing about his appearance. Some people said of him in real life he had a little button nose. I don't know, from some pictures that look as if they were without makeup. Didn't seem to me really, that would seem to be extreme. But the very impressive noses he has in different roles were the result of a great deal of putting, because he was very sensitive about the appearance of his nose in a performance. I don't know that that's the same as stage fright, or even that her story is related to stage fright. I just don't know.
Well, I was actually very impressed with his demeanor, because despite the fact that he was genius, and that his films were so often ill-received by the production companies and stuff like that, he still seemed to have...
For what reason?
Because he was sort of ahead of his time, or he often...
No, because they wouldn't make money.
They wouldn't make money. Well, he said he was too dark for the public.
Which means that people wouldn't buy tickets. That's what they were afraid of.
But he still seemed very happy, which surprised me. He seemed very boisterous in a way, so he didn't seem to be set back by that at all, which I thought was...
Well, but he also, in the midst of that ebullient, or at the end of that ebullient conversation that went on for, actually it was 3.5 hours, and you saw the shortened version, he does say, I think I went into the wrong business. Remember that? He says, 98% of my time as a filmmaker was put into hustling. Isn't that what he said? And only 2% in making films. And that's not a life. The truth is that he was wonderfully entertaining in society. He was a great storyteller. He was an actor. And the producers were all friends of his. They used to play cards, I'm sure. And they invited him to their homes for all their parties. He went in the hope of getting money out of them to make more movies, and he never got anything. They were just stringing him along because he was so entertaining. And, that's a great sadness, and any artist should have to submit to that. Toward the end, he generally paid for most of his movies because he got huge fees. Advertising, is it Mason's California wine? We never sell the wine before it's time, something like that. On television, and in different acting roles, and he would take any worthless role in somebody's movie just because he would get such a large fee, and then he would pour that into his movies. I think that's heroic, marvelous. But think of what a strain it is on him.
Yeah. But he said every time he did that, he lost part of his artist in him or something like that.
It's true. People, when he died, and not as much now, spoke of him as being terribly overweight, because he was. So what? Very fat, remember? And famous for his commercials on television. You know, disregarding the whole achievement of this great man in at least one art, which is filmmaking, not to speak of the theater and writing, short story writing and other writings, as a politician who wrote speeches for Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Roosevelt encouraged him to run for senator in, as you remember from the documentary, of Wisconsin. No, there was much more to him than people recognize.
Right, I just think that when he took roles that he didn't respect, then he lost self-esteem, and so I think that's why.
But he kept on going. I
Yeah.
mean, like in the, what of it? Just keep on. Bogdanovich reports him being very gloomy about the time the documentary was made because of how he was treated by the profession. And Bogdanovich tried to calm him down. And Wells said, he's about the future. That's the way you always say, oh, you'll be recognized in the future. And Wells said, oh, yeah, in 40 years, they'll love me. Well, it took only about 25. He died 1985, or now it's 19 years ago, and he's now a cult figure and recognized as the great man and genius that he was.
So even in 1985, he wasn't recognized in that way?
Nope.
Well, he had an
And
ambulance
the last movie he had finished and was in complete control of was F for Fake, and that dates back into the 1970s. After that, there were all of those unfinished things, including When Will You Finish Don Quixote? Remember, he calls that the Don Quixote movie, and he says, I'm thinking of calling it When Will You Finish Don Quixote? Because that's what his friends all say. I think you may remember from the book that I found an interview with him made about 20 years before he died, in which he said he had finished Don Quixote and that he wasn't ready to release it because the trial, which based on Kafka's novel and a very, very interesting movie in many ways, had been attacked commercially and critically and by everybody. And he said he wasn't ready to release another movie to be attacked that way. So that's very sad. That part of his life is very, very sad. But it's still, so I feel protective, as I say in the last page or so. But I nevertheless admire his fortitude in going on and doing as much as he did. What else about the documentary would you like to say, since most of you haven't yet and will today see the Magnificent Ambersons?
Well, one thing I was struck by was Wells had such a great sense of humor in the documentary. He's always making jokes or telling funny stories, but in Citizen Kane, which is the only Wells film I've seen, there isn't really that much humor. And this was surprising to me because in Hitchcock's interview, Hitchcock seemed very somber. He didn't really make any jokes or anything, but his movies are filled with humor.
Right,
So
I think that's
thought
true.
That was interesting, how Wells has such a great sense of humor, but he doesn't necessarily put it into his films.
That's a very good point. Hitchcock is a humorist, and it's a structural device that he mingles with the romance on the one hand and the thrilling the elements of thriller on the other hand. If it gets too heavy, then the audience loses its patience and the suspense sags. So to lighten it up, you have to have some comedy. But the comedy has to be relevant, and if it's a romance movie, then, love and sex are always funny, seen from the point of view of somebody outside who isn't suffering at the moment, right? So that ties in very nicely together. Now, not all of his movies are like that, really, but the most famous ones, the most successful ones are North by Northwest. That's a suspense, a romance comedy, and Cary Grant is the perfect choice because he combines both comedy and romance. But even Eva St. Marie is witty in places, right? So that's a structural element in Hitchcock, and it's true of other films, many other films of that sort that Hitchcock directed. In Wells, if you say what comedy did he ever write, I don't know what to say exactly. Maybe let me think. Well, there are comic elements, but they're much less structural. For instance, Mr. Bernstein. No, there are two pronunciations of that name, but in Wells it's Bernstein. Mr. Bernstein, the first time he comes in, I think it is, he falls as if on a banana, carrying in the furnishings. And what does he say? He says, "Oops," as if it were a comic strip. And he's always a sort of comic figure. And he plays it that way. He's a straight man for Cain, and we laugh at that. He's this, this little subordinate who says anything, anything to make the boss happy. And then if he laughs about it at his own expense. At the party, when Cain is about to go off to Europe, the Nazi's going to go off to Europe, Bernstein shouts, "Mr. Cain, there are still other antiques or works of art there that you haven't bought. Are you going to buy them?" Something like that, you remember? And Cain says, "I'm going to buy them all," whatever, right? And then a few seconds later, he said, "I promise," something like that. And a few seconds later, he says, "Mr. Bernstein, you don't expect me to keep my promises, do you?" And Bernstein laughs like the little toady that he is and says, "Oh, yes." He accepts the irony of the deceptiveness of his own boss. That's what Bernstein is like. And so that's comic. And then what's also comic is the transformation in Bernstein. Because when the reporter interviews him, Bernstein is the chairman of the board, right? We remember he's a big magnate now, and the reporter says, "I hope you're not too busy," and he says, "No, I can easily imitate his accent because I was born in Brooklyn. No, I have plenty of time, Mr. Thompson." Is that what it is? "I'm the chairman of the board. I've got nothing to do," right? So he makes fun of himself. That's a comic element that inserted in the right way by Wells. But it's not, you're right, it's not as full and powerful a device as comedy and humor are in Hitchcock. There's a great deal of humor, as you'll find in Renoir, but Renoir's humor is even subtler than Hitchcock's. I mean, he's more subtler than Hitchcock and even subtler than Wells. Though Hitchcock can be very subtle. I mean, for me, it's subtle. I don't know if I pointed out to you when you saw 39 Steps, and there's the brawl at the beginning in the theater, and the stage manager jumps onto the stage and says, "Gentlemen, gentlemen, please, you're not at home." And I remember seeing that many times before the humor of it came to me. It's so subtle. What he's saying is, being the creatures that you are, you're probably fighting at home all the time. You can't do that here in public, in the theater. So it's very rich, I think, and yet still subtle. So it is as if Hitchcock is not capable of a great deal of subtlety. He is in everything he does. Okay. Anything else? Now I want to leave enough time for us to get to the movie without keeping you too late. But I also want to have plenty of time to discuss this week's reading, which is the Wells chapter, and ideas about the biography and the documentary, and Ed's ideas about the Magnificent Ambersons in preparation for what you'll be seeing. Did you have more to say?
No thoughts come to mind.
It may be that my chapter serves as an introduction to you. I've prepared you, perhaps, for what to expect in Magnificent Ambersons. One thing I do want to repeat, though, emphasize, I was repeating what's in the chapter, is the way in which Wells is capable of feelings that one usually don't find critics ascribing to him. They talk about him playing the king roles, remember the way he says, and therefore in a very pompous, authoritarian, even bombastic way, and fitted with that wonderful, unmistakable voice of his. If you ever hear that voice, you know that's Orson Welles. Though he was very, as a little aside, he dubbed 7 of the parts in the trial, and nobody can tell. He was such a good mimic that he could make his voice sound different and appropriate for the different parts that he wanted. But in his ordinary delivery, that's Orson Welles, right? What he is not given credit for is the depth of feeling that he expresses. And that's why I quoted that passage in Magnificent Ambersons that you'll be seeing, which he wrote himself, based on a much slighter reference in the Booth Tarkington novel, but which he makes into just a short paragraph, but a very telling moment in the history of cinema. And it's about, and presented with a great deal of compassionate feelings for the failure for George Minifer, who falls on his knees in the bed, next to the bed of, in his mother's bedroom, where she used to sleep before she died, and begs forgiveness for the harm he's wreaked, and hoping that she and God can forgive him. And then the voiceover gives that paragraph that you read in the chapter, that people, all of whom were hoping that he would get his comeuppance, would be delighted, but nobody would even remember him anymore, or all of that would be insignificant, because they would all be dead or moved away or something. That's part of the myth of the past. We think that in the future people are going to be looking back, and it's a myth. Dr. Samuel Johnson, you know, the 18th century great man, English literature, he said, if you're ever depressed because of any faux pas you make in public, anything you do that you're ashamed of or embarrassed by, you've disgraced yourself in some way, just remember, in a year, nobody will remember it ever happened. Another way of putting it is, you know, if you think of it, what's called under the aspect of eternity, sub specie aeternitatis, under the aspect of eternity, however terrible it might seem to you It's insignificant. It doesn't matter. You've got to get to a stage where you don't worry about the future or the past because it doesn't matter. Nobody's keeping score. It's not as if anybody will know the terrible thing you did when you splashed the hostess with your martini, and everyone was horrified. It doesn't matter.
History seems to remember the heroic moments much better than the mistakes.
Say that again?
History seems to remember the heroic moments, the triumphs. People remember those great things, but
they don't remember the heroic ones either. That's
my
the
mother
point.
only remembers the mistakes. She doesn't remember any of my heroic moments.
But then for
the subject of the book.
well, the irony is that we have to. It's more. Human life is more than that. Human life is if you're of this persuasion, if you're not religious. If you're religious, you're going to have to put a different filter into the camera. But if you're not, if you think that what I'm doing is putting a filter in, there's no permanence. Life doesn't go on very long and may not go on even for the race or for the whole universe. Who knows? What difference will it make on Cassiopeia or some other remote galaxy, what happens in this place? At the same time, we always live in the present, and for us, this is life. All of these things do matter because they matter to us. And therefore, just to say, oh, it doesn't matter, is what the psychopath might say, or the sociopath, the mass murderer. No, what difference does it make? After the Battle of Waterloo, not the Battle of Waterloo, the Battle of Austerlitz, Napoleon is walked across the battlefield where the dead were all strewn all around, the thousands of French that they lost in that battle, and he's reported of having said to one of his marshals, "A good night in Paris will make up for all this." Sure, I mean, you can plant seeds all the time, but the indefeasibility, the uniqueness of each of these individuals, which we accept for ourselves, we think of ourselves as unique individuals, and after a while, if you live as long as I do, you begin to see that everyone feels that way about themselves. That's a human tragedy. That what I feel about me is what everyone feels, and maybe even everything that lives, including the chicken that you had for dinner today. That's the horror of life. Well, then you just can't say, well, of course it doesn't matter. The chicken would have died sooner or later. It didn't want to die when it did die. And the hostess will die, and nobody will remember about your faux pas with a martini. But at that moment, this is your life, and it's horrible. So one has to live with the dynamic of these two alternatives, and that's also part of the myth of the past, or at least an examination of the myth of the past. And Wells reveals how compassionate he can be for George at that moment, without saying, well, of course, in the future nobody will remember this. Or people who wanted to give his comeuppance don't remember it. In the Othello movie that Wells made and acted the main role in, he shows much more compassion for this suffering man who's suffering from this terrible psychological disease called jealousy than Olivier or Gielgud or any of the famous Shakespearean actors who respond to the magnificence of the poetry and shout and carry on and scream in accordance with the melodrama, and we never quite get the sense of sadness and the condition that this man is in, particularly in view of the innocence of his wife, what he stands to lose when he kills her, and allows himself to be humiliated by Iago. Now, how sad that is. You get that in Wells's production. though it has other faults in it.
I think the idea that you were saying about how life is sort of meaningless, I mean, I think that's an insight that's like at the center of what it is to be human. I mean, reconciling the idea that at this moment, like, what I'm doing, like, I feel it's incredibly important how people are responding to me and reacting to me. But at the same time, the idea that it's all meaningless. Like, I mean, that's so hard to like, what do you do with those conflicting ideas of life? I think that's really insightful.
We ought to get going in about 3 minutes. I don't suppose any of you can stay after 5. The movie is 88 minutes long. But very quickly, I want to remind you of the second paper, and that the second paper is more important than the first paper. Actually, on the whole, all of you did reasonably well. There's a gradation, but it doesn't matter where you stand in terms of the grades, because the second paper can make up a lot. If you got a B+, you could very well end up with an A or an A-. If you got less, it's harder. I don't treat the papers equally. What I will do is read them and think of your performance in class for borderline cases. But the papers are very important in the grade and make the main criterion of the grade. So that don't be depressed if you didn't get as high a grade for the first paper as you thought. It's very hard for us to be fair either in other people's grades or in the process of grading. There isn't any mystical scientific perfection in grades. So I always try to be a little generous. But make up the deficiencies in the second paper. You're all clear about what to do in the second paper? It's due 2 weeks from today. Next week, we're going to talk at the very beginning about your paper. So get your imagination going. Start working out an outline or a first draft. And I will consult with you about the contents to make sure you don't fall into a ditch, unless it's a very acidic ditch. In general, you all know my email address. Send me with any problems. I'm very accessible. Let me know how I can be of help for the second paper. As I tried all your know for the first paper, well, I'll try even harder for the second paper.
Will you be checking your email over break?
What?
Will you be checking your email over break at all, or no?
Why not? I'm always open for business. The brain never rests. The mind does, but the brain is always operating. Remember, the second paper is not as limited to a portion of the assigned reading as the first one, so you can wander a little further. But one thing that you all have to really keep in mind is you also are expected to do more careful outside research. Some of you did at least the minimum, but I think more than half just sort of threw out something without really working at it and doing much with it. It isn't that it has to be 10 books or 10 articles or even more than one article, but it's something that you work at as a problem that is relevant to the course and relevant to what you want to say and gives you access to somebody else in order to emancipate yourself from the terrible influence of Irving Singer. And that's essential for discovering your own creativity on your own. So that, remember, in writing the paper. And the length is longer and all the rest. Remember the footnotes. I mean, the footnotes and word count and page numbers. Not that I graded any bit down on there not being the word count this time. All right? Anything you want to say about the second paper? All right, then why don't we walk over to watch Magnificent Emerson's now.